This is part 2 of the English colonization video lecture. We're picking back up with Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in basically 1675, 1676. And it occurred in Virginia. This is an image of the tobacco fields that would have been planted in Virginia at the time. Tobacco is an interesting crop in that it requires a great deal of care. It's very high maintenance, and it requires a great deal of land for a couple of reasons. Tobacco, these are small tobacco plants. They're not fully grown yet. So it takes a lot of land to grow tobacco. The plants themselves basically sap or suck all of the nutrients out of the soil, and they do it in a matter of a couple of years. So farmers were always looking to acquire more land because after a few years the land would not grow any more tobacco, and so they were too dependent actually on tobacco. It was a get-rich-quick scheme, and it saved the colony, but it at a great price. So it took the nutrients out of the soil, leaving it fallow, and then it required a great deal of land as far as spreading out these plants because they are so big. Additionally, lots of labor was required because there were worms, very large, yucky worms, that eat these plants, and they can eat one worm can eat many leaves in one day. So every plant and every leaf on every plant had to be checked at least once a week. So it required a great deal of labor. So if you see how much land is consumed or is in use, you see that there was a lot of labor that was needed. It was acres and acres and acres. Then you had the issue of they were not crop rotating. They didn't do crop rotations at the time, and so there were all sorts of issues. The land became very very useless basically after just a few years. Now, in that, George Washington, later on in the 1750s and 60s, was very much into experimentation. And so he worked his way out of tobacco planting because of these issues with tobacco plants. However, he was wealthy enough that he could handle the risk as far as if he had a field of tobacco that didn't make, or if something doesn't work, it was not going to ruin him financially. Most farmers weren't unable to do this. So people like George Washington the more well-to-do planters would experiment with different crops. Well, other crops grow great on this same land. It's just that the tobacco saps out certain nutrients, and once those nutrients are gone, it may take 10, 20 years for it to rejuvenate itself. So there were all sorts of issues with tobacco. Additionally, transporting the tobacco was a problem because the leaves, they have to be dried and cured and all that. Then they were put into what are called hogsheads, and it's hogsheads, hogsheads. Basically, they're big barrels. They called them hogsheads, and they used them as a way of measuring. We had issues with selling or sending the tobacco to the merchants or the factors in England, who would then, they might, if the hogsheads got damp on while being transported on ships, well, then the tobacco ruined, it molded, and it was useless. So it was a very volatile market in England. Prices went up, prices went down, and if all you were planting is tobacco, then you can be financially ruined, or you can have a financial boom. Just depends on the situation. So it was a very volatile problem, and it was also a problem with not being diversified, which the South is notoriously not diversified. they eventually planted all tobacco in northern North Carolina, all of Virginia, Maryland, and then they move into in the South, like in the deep South in South Carolina, Georgia, eventually Alabama, Mississippi. They're growing all cotton. So they were totally undiversified there as well. So if the market goes up, it's great. If the market goes down, you're in big trouble. So there was not a lot of forward thinking in these situations. It was boom or bust, and if it was a boom right now, then everybody went to whatever the crop was in South Carolina. It was indigo for blue dye, or rice, or some cotton. Then in Georgia it was all cotton. Alabama it was all cotton. So and that's down the road, of course. But that's all to say that the southern planters were not exactly, most of them were not that forward thinking. For whatever reason, either they were not wealthy enough to risk it, or they just didn't care, and this was what they were doing for a quick buck now. So anyway, you have Bacon's Rebellion, and it's named after Nathaniel Bacon. So there were, in the middle of this shift, it was 1675, 76. Virginia was in a shift between, and all the colonies, but Virginia particularly, between white indentured servants and African slaves. And it was accelerated by this big deal called Bacon's Rebellion. Governor Berkeley, who was the royal governor of Virginia, had been in governor for 30 years. He was corrupt, of course. Politicians back then, there's nothing new under the sun. Politicians become corrupt when they stay in power this long. So he was in an alliance with this inner circle of all these elite planters. Okay, so his friends were the rich guys. So these rich planters were rewarded by Berkeley with land grants. Basically, Berkeley was giving away free land to these wealthy people. And the way that you got rich additionally in colonial America was to get a political office, meaning you could be a justice of the peace. That was one of the most lucrative. You got kickbacks like crazy. People paid you, they paid your fees, and to be a justice of the peace, to be a tax collector, all these different jobs that you were appointed officials, then sheriffs later down the road, that you were very lucrative for people. So people wanted these cushy kinds of jobs on the side because that was the way they got cash. Another thing is currency, money. Back in the colonial days was in short supply in the colonies. They never had enough money. They basically used Spanish doubloons because that was the most common currency. That was the first global currency in history because there was so much from the silver and gold that was mined by the Spaniards in the 16th century in England and South Carolina and South America and Mexico. So they were cash poor here in the colonies. They operated on credit, meaning because the colonies were not producing everything that they needed to survive, they looked to Britain, to England, for the goods that they needed or wanted, for that matter. So, because you got to remember, these guys were still British servants, British subjects. So, British subjects still wanted all the things that everybody wanted at home. They were still considered British citizens. They had all the rights to British citizens that were conferred upon British citizens. And so that will come into play when we get to the Declaration of Independence, because these colonies were established upon the principle that these were just outposts. The people living in the colonies had the exact same rights as they had the people living at home in England did. So if you are here and you're living here, then if you're represented in Parliament and you're living in Britain, then you should also be represented in Parliament if you're living in the colonies. But that's a whole other story, and we'll talk about that later as we get towards independence. For now, in the 1670s, The only people who had a right to vote were the people who were landowners. And so they're making it more and more difficult to be able to vote. So they're putting restrictions on who can vote. You had to be a landowner. You had all these property qualifications. These people were not all well off. A majority were not well off. They were impoverished. So that meant that you were not able to vote. So they were unrepresented. And remember, Virginia has a colonial assembly that's elected to handle the day-to-day operations. Eventually, all the colonies had elected assemblies that were locally elected by the people here, who were charged with overseeing the day-to-day operations, making the rules, because the king is 3,000 miles away in England. He never set foot in the colonies. It was too dangerous. It took too long to get here, and so he never came here. Also, it took turnaround time on a letter was 6 to 7 weeks one way. So if you wrote a letter to somebody, you might expect a reply, if you were very lucky, in 3 months. So communication was terrible. And so the king really couldn't handle the day-to-day operations in these colonies. So by the 1670s, you have this policy of, basically, it's called salutary neglect. And that means that the British government, the British crown, they just let the colonies handle themselves. As long as they kept getting shipments of goods from the colonies, then everything was fine. And they just let the colonies rock along and all that. They had other things to deal with at home. So Berkeley, the governor of Virginia, had good relations with the Indians. And the reason was he was involved in trade with the Indians. So he wanted to make sure they were happy. So, because it benefited him personally. It was a personal, personally, financially lucrative for him to deal with these Indians. He let that get in the way of his governing power. So he refused to allow white settlers to encroach on their land, meaning he refused to allow these white people to go out and just settle their land indiscriminately and take it from them, which is what had been happening. He wanted to make sure those Indians were happy. So the white colonists get mad that he's showing partiality to the Indians and refusing to allow them to settle because he wants to enrich his own personal checkbook, basically. So by 1676, there's widespread resentment. These people don't have, the poorer people don't have any representation in this elected assembly, which is called the House of Burgesses. It had been in operation since 1619. They're mad because he is not allowing them to spread out and acquire more land so that they can plant more tobacco, which will benefit everybody, the colony and everybody. They're heavily taxed locally. They never ever paid until 1760-ish, with the first Sugar Act and all that started basically the road towards revolution. The colonists only paid taxes to their own colony. So if I'm a Virginia citizen, I'm not paying any taxes to anybody but the Virginia colony, the Virginia government. I don't pay any taxes to the crown, which is a pretty good deal. I do pay taxes for the support of the Anglican Church. That is a requirement, but that goes into my colony, not to the crown. So by 1676, no, it's 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, they're already mad, and the colonists are revolting basically against the government. So there's, deep roots here as well. A confrontation between Indians and colonists sparked this whole problem. Nathaniel Bacon, this is Nathaniel, he was the son of a wealthy Englishman. Well, he liked to spend money. So his dad said, okay, you've spent your inheritance here in England. You're headed over to Virginia so that you can learned the value of a pound. And so he sends the son, Nathaniel, off, and he arrives in the colony in 1673. Well, it so happens that Nathaniel is related by marriage to Governor Berkeley's wife. As a result of that personal relationship, Nathaniel is given, by Governor Berkeley, he's given a seat in the House of Burgesses, which is the elected assembly. Another issue with, good old boy politics even back in the day. So Nathaniel goes off sort of north of Jamestown, and he establishes a farm. And so he becomes a farmer. Now he advocates for the removal of all Indians from the colony because he believes that, it's, like all Englishmen, that it's, and Europeans in general, that it's their God-given right. This is God's plan. And they all think that colonization is God's plan, and they have to make sure they remove all obstacles to God's plan. It also happens that it's good for them to do this. So he says that all Indians should be removed from the colony. He wants a reduction in the taxes because there's an economic recession. The tobacco prices in England had bottomed out, and so everybody's poor. And he wants the taxes that were hefty to be reduced, and he wants an end to the rule by the rich. So the people who support him, they rally behind him, and the bulk of his supporters were former indentured servants. So they'd served out their terms, and they were basically roaming the colony because they didn't have any land. Some of them had been promised land, some had not been. So they were basically young men roaming around, partying and, carousing and causing a problem. There were a few of the free blacks left, landless men, so basically ne'er-do-wells or poor people, and small farmers. So these were the people who were supporting him, all people who were not rich, note. So what he does is this. Let me make sure. Yep. I didn't want to make sure I hadn't skipped one. So the results of this rebellion, over a period of 10 months or so in 1676, they have basically a fight with some Native Americans. Well, it was the wrong Native Americans. These were Native Americans that they attacked and killed several chiefs. These Native Americans had not caused a problem with the white settlers. They were mistaken. The white settlers who attacked them were mistaken. Well, that sets off a whole big problem with everybody. So there's another massacre by the Native Americans, and Nathaniel Bacon goes to Jamestown and says, I want my seat back, because he had been removed from the House of Burgesses as a result of his rebellious activities. So he goes down to Jamestown and he says, I want my seat back. And Governor Berkeley says, not a chance. Well, Nathaniel goes back home and gets all his supporters out. They float down the river into Jamestown, and they set fire and burn Jamestown to the ground. They burn Jamestown to the ground. Governor Berkeley flees out to a ship off the coast of Virginia until everything settles down. So what happens is the elite people try to improve their image. They try to cultivate the support of their poorer neighbors. So what they do is they try to include the poorer neighbors, at least in lip service, to not being so elitist and so discriminatory. To prevent rebellions among whites, they moved from white indentured servants to African slaves that they could control more easily. The reason they could control these people is because not that African slaves thought that it was okay to be enslaved, they were more off kilter. If you are in a country that you don't know anybody, your skin tone is different, so it's very obvious that, chances are you're a runaway, or that that you're an enslaved person and you have no rights. Um, it is much easier if you don't know anybody, if you don't know anything about the terrain, about how to live on your own in a new place, then you're much less likely to revolt. Whereas these white indentured servants, when their terms were up, they were basically causing trouble because they didn't have anything to do. They didn't have any land. They didn't have any money to buy any land, and so they had no jobs. So they moved from white indentured servitude to African enslaved people. They reduced the taxes. They came up with a more aggressive Indian policy. They made sure that they were the Governor Berkeley's policy of partiality towards the Native Americans was gone, and they opened up the land to Western settlement so that these white people could move farther and farther west in search of more land to cultivate in tobacco so they could improve their wealth. Now, the Bacon's Rebellion, he gets sick and he dies in October of 1676. And so he dies, and the rebellion just disappears, basically. It loses its steam after Nathaniel Bacon dies. And there were other issues. There were complaints from the colonies over the next 100 years, but that was really the first, and it subsides, and people go back along their way, and they complain some, but they don't go back into this rebellion like this again. So, back to Barbados and the West Indies. Sugar was the basis of the economy in the Caribbean. Tobacco, it was tobacco in the mainland colonies, and then sugar in the Caribbean colonies. The French had some Caribbean colonies, as did the Dutch too. It wasn't just English. And then Spain as well. They had absentee plantation owners, like we spoke about before. The malaria, yellow fever, and the heat and overwork in general, were the main causes of the deaths, the high mortality rate in the Caribbean and in Brazil as well. The Barbados Slave Code from 1661 it was the strictest code in the world, and the reason that relates to us is that the Barbadians who settle Carolina will bring that slave code with them, and they reestablish it here, and it gets even more restrictive as the enslaved population increases over the next 150, 200 years. The plantation colonies, which would be basically Maryland, Virginia, Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia in 1733. I'll take that back. Georgia was not a slave colony, so this would be Maryland, not at the beginning anyway. Originally, it would be Maryland, Virginia, and Carolina. So you had those plantation colonies. They were heavily dependent on slave labor. They caused the white colonists to be spread out because the plantations were so large. So you had a large number of enslaved people who at any moment could revolt, and this momentary revolt became more and more possible. The risk increased as the population became much more heavily there were so many more slaves than there were white settlers, so that was a problem. You've got one man and his family, and then you have 100 enslaved people on a plantation, and you might have an overseer maybe, and then they're spread out in their 500 acres or 1,000 acres worth of land, and then your next neighbor is 3 miles down the road. So the enslaved people they were well aware of the possibilities. It's really amazing that it didn't happen more often than it did. on these plantations. You had field hands, and that was the lion's share of the jobs. Then you had house workers, you had cooks. You also had artisans, barrel makers, wheel and carriage makers, glass blowers, basket makers, gardeners, those kinds of different jobs. These artisans were, if you were skilled, your value was much greater. And so what might happen is in some urban areas, particularly in the north, if you had a skill like you could make barrels, or you could make wheels and carriages, or you were a glass blower, or those kinds of things, you might be rented out into a business in town, and then your owner, you might live in town even. There were people in Savannah that had there were group homes where you might have 5 or 6 enslaved people go into Savannah from their plantation, and they would stay during the week together, and they had curfews, and there were limits to what they could do and those kinds of things, but they were living a fairly independent life during the week. They would go home on the weekends. They would take their pay. Well, depending, it was a case by case thing, but depending on the owner, that enslaved person might be allowed to keep some of his pay. And so if that was the case, in some places you were allowed to buy your freedom. And that was not in the South. That would be in the North. But they did not allow that in the South, because they did not want they didn't want enslaved people to see that you could buy your freedom, because it might give them ideas that they might want to be free. And so it might, incite a riot or whatever, or a rebellion. So that was more in the North. Another thing that needs to be said here is that slavery over time changes, and slavery also changes colony to colony, state to state, region to region. So to make blanket statements about slavery is almost impossible. We have to take it either region by region, or time by time, or both. So it's a fluid type thing, and the biggest part is that it didn't stay the same. So there's that. So colonizing the Carolinas. If you look, Charles II in 1663, he allows 8 proprietors this is Carolina in 1663, and then they extended in 1665. Okay, so 1670, the first settlers arrived. It took them that long to get all this worked out. They did not want the Spaniards coming up into Virginia. So it was basically, Carolina was also an extension of Barbados. There was a shortage of land. They were looking, like we said earlier, they were looking for opportunities for those younger sons. And as we said before, they had armed some of the Indians to raid Spanish Florida. But if you look, this is a huge area, and this is, obviously the states where they are now. So, but you get the idea. So we talked about this. They originally wanted to have this first constitution proposed a feudal society, meaning it was going to be like in the days back in, the days of where you had a lord, and you had the nobility and the serfs, and then you had enslaved people, and they wanted to just recreate England, which it obviously didn't happen that way. They wanted to attract settlers quickly, so they said, oh, yes, you can have an elected assembly. We'll have religious toleration, because they're trying to attract as many colonists as they can. Because if you are England, you want your own colonists occupying the land that you say you own. If you claim that land, you need to have people living on it, because otherwise the Indians will attack those few colonists that decide to go. The Spaniards will think, oh, we could just go take over. That just because they say it, they don't have but 50 people living there, so we'll go take over. So they want plenty of people here. So they're doing all these great things to allow them. They have this head right system, another big deal. 150 acres for every member of the family. So, an example, if I go and take I have 6 members of my family. I get 150 acres per person. So I get 150 acres times 150 acres times 6. That means I have 900 acres free just for bringing my family with me. Now, if I bring 10 male servants, that's another 1,000 acres. And suddenly I have 1,900 acres. So if I can afford, if I'm a rich English guy and I want to afford to get a bunch of land for free in Carolina, all I need to do is bring my 6 family members and bring 10 men, and we're good to go. So you're automatically rich. You're automatically rich. If you can afford the passage, you get all this land. And so that's how you establish this plantation economy, is with these head right systems. Does it cost the king anything? No. This land is, according to him, it's free. Yes, it's Native American land. Did they buy it from Native Americans? No. The English just said it was God's plan that they were to colonize, and so it's free for the taking. Nobody's improved it, quote unquote. Improving means nobody built a barn on it. Nobody set up a fence. So for the English, it looks like nobody's using this land, even though the Native Americans live on it. They hunt it. They live on it. Their idea of land ownership is totally different than the English or the Europeans in general. Europeans want to throw up a fence, put a house on it. It's my land. Well, the Indians believed that they were just borrowing the land for while they were here, while they lived here. And then when they died, they were just borrowing the land. And so they were very conservationist about it. So, as we said before, 1712, North Carolina splits off and it becomes North Carolina and South Carolina. Maryland was a Catholic haven. It was intended as a Catholic haven. That is not what it became. This is Lord Baltimore, as in Baltimore, Maryland. This is Lord Baltimore, and he wants to set up a Catholic haven. He was a Catholic, obviously. He wants to recreate feudal England. Again, just like the Carolinas, they want to recreate feudal England so that the nobility's in charge, because he's the nobility, so why shouldn't he be in charge? So he wanted white indentured servants to come. He did allow religious freedom for Christians, and he has the Act of Toleration in 1649 that's a twist, meaning a Catholic haven. That is not the way it turned out. Protestants continued to flow into, basically, Maryland was just another Virginia. They were growing tobacco. They had originally wanted white indentured servants. Instead, they got slavery established there as well. And so the Protestants who came to Maryland were still persecuting the Catholics who came, because there were more Protestants than Catholics. The Catholics were still in the minority. So it was sort of a Catholic haven. It was the only colony that accepted Catholics. So that's something you need to know. And then the final colony is Georgia, and that was the buffer colony. In 1733, James Oglethorpe, this is James, a young picture of James. He was in Parliament, and he wanted to he was a philanthropist. So he had friends who were in debtor's prison. So if you couldn't pay your bills in England, if you fell upon hard luck, if you lost your job, if you had too many kids and you didn't make enough money and you couldn't pay your bills, you got to go to debtor's prison. The question is, how were they supposed to pay their bills if they couldn't work because they were in debtor's prison? But that's, I'm not sure how that worked. Never got an answer for that. But anyway, so James wants to set up a philanthropic colony. So he and some friends get together and they get this charter from the king. Well, the king is increasingly concerned about the Spaniards in Florida. And so they have all these incursions. And by now, South Carolina is a major cotton producer, indigo producer, rice producer. And so they don't want anybody to threaten that industry and that shipping out of Charleston particularly. So you have dual purposes here. You have Oglethorpe and his philanthropic ideals, and then you have the king who wants to protect Charleston at all cost from the Spaniards in south to the south in Florida. So you have James Oglethorpe, who sets up originally Savannah. Now his idea is this, and it wasn't prisoners and criminals and it was not a penal colony. Yes, there were debtors. Yes, there were unemployed people, but there were also a lot of employed people, so in small farmers. So it was not all prisoners. That Georgia gets a bad rap about that. What James Oglethorpe did was he set all of these, it was not a royal colony to start with. It became a royal colony in 1750. But at the beginning, James Oglethorpe and his joint stock companies are like the precursor to corporations today. People would get together, businessmen would get together, and they'd all invest money in this joint stock company so that nobody was taking it was very expensive to establish a colony. So the king couldn't afford to do it. Seriously, the king could not afford to do this because it's so expensive. So they used business people the king granted the land to the joint stock company. The joint stock company put the money in to pay for the startup cost. And it might be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years before they got a return. These joint stock companies never intended to be involved in this investment for life. Their goal was to invest the money, make money, and then get out and sell their interest in the company and go on and do other business dealings. So they wanted to sell out and get their money and go. But it might be a longer process, a 4 or 5 or 10-year investment before they got their money. So anyway, James had some conditions on the people who went to the colonies, to Georgia colony. They could not have slaves because he believed that the white settlers would be lazy, that enslaved people would make the white settlers lazy. So he says no slaves. He allowed no rum because he said that rum was bad for the Native Americans because they drank too much, which is pretty much true, and no Catholics. Jewish people could come, that was fine. All kinds of Protestants that could come, that was fine. Lutherans, all kinds of people, just not Catholics. So that tells you how they feel about Catholics, and it all goes back to King Henry VIII back in the mid-16th century. Yeah, mid-1500s, when he split from the Catholic Church. So there's that. It was a buffer colony to protect South Carolina, basically. Here in the Georgia, they grew rice, indigo, and cotton, just like in South Carolina. The complaint with the colonists in Georgia at the beginning, almost immediately from the time they arrived, they said, we can't compete with Charleston, with South Carolina businesses because we don't have slaves. We can never, ever establish plantations. Well, Oglethorpe didn't want them to establish plantations. He wanted a colony of small farmers. He didn't want these huge plantations. And so he said, no slaves. Now, he fought this battle for 17 years. The charter was up, and it became a royal colony, and the king took over in 1750. Well, all of the rules that Oglethorpe had established went out the door immediately. Slavery was allowed, rum was allowed because they had a huge deerskin trade in Georgia with the Native Americans, and that rum was a great way to trade with the Native Americans to get all the deerskin. And they shipped deerskins out to England like crazy for clothes and hats and coats. Also, it was a very high fashion at the time, just like beaver pelts in the north. Rum was a problem because it made the natives restless, literally. And so Oglethorpe believed they were more likely to attack the settlements, the English settlements, if they were drunk. And so he also didn't want the white people drinking either. So it was like prohibition. But anyway, so it became a royal colony in 1750, and all of these rules went out the door. That is when the plantation system got really going in Georgia. Up until that time, you had basically small farmers, because if you didn't have slaves, you did not have enough money to hire workers to plant dozens and dozens of acres of tobacco or anything like that. So there is the end of English colonization, and I hope that explains a little bit more. We will move on to the mid 1750s, mid 18th century now. Thanks.